everyone. I am Tronvoll Stefanos, and this is ERISAT's The Power of One program. Today is April 17th, 2023. Professor Kjetil Tronvoll is my guest today with a PhD in political anthropology. Professor Kjetil has conducted extensive research in Eritrea and Ethiopia about peace and conflict, and he has written several books about it. Welcome, Professor, and thank you for being here. To extend the introduction a bit more, what is political anthropology, the field of your research?
Well, social anthropology, as you know, is a study of cultures and social cultural habits and traits. Political anthropology is the kind of looking at the political aspects of culture, societies, how they organize themselves, how they act, how they relate, what kind of how cultural traits influence and impact political thinking. I can use that term maybe, but also of course it is a study of pure political processes, be that conflict and wars, human rights, elections, institution buildings, accountability, and so on. So it is a more of a mixed method approach than pure social cultural anthropology, where you can say maybe it's also leading towards political science and in some of the modeling.
Okay, very good. So let me also briefly take you back to 𝐒𝐄𝐂𝐍𝐃, a village you have written a book about. The book is 𝐒𝐄𝐂𝐍𝐃, a highland village in Eritrea, a study of the people, their livelihood, and land tenure during times of turbulence. So when did you start working in 𝐒𝐄𝐂𝐍𝐃, and why this particular village? And what was it like then, and what is it like today?
Yeah, many good questions. That book is based upon my dissertation research, and as an anthropologist, you know, it's kind of once in a lifetime where you can choose really where to go and do your dissertation fieldwork. I started to prepare my dissertation fieldwork in the late 1980s, and at that time I was very interested and intrigued to study a society as totally different as the one I had been brought up in. That means in suburban Norway, very peaceful, very quiet, very homogeneous society. So I wanted to study a community at war, where macro factors as famine, migration, conflicts impacted local communities, and then how these communities managed to survive purely physically, but also how they culturally reproduced themselves, how war and macro stress factors impacted local cultural traditions. And at the same time, I was intrigued by theories of nationalism and wanted then to particularly focus on peasant recruitments to liberation armies or resistant armies. So at that time, late 1980s, I looked at the global map and the kind of where do you have these kind of conflicts in Southeast Asia, Southern Africa, Horn of Africa, and Central America at that time. But rather quickly, I got to understand as I read up on the different conflicts that the Eritrean War of Liberation was likely coming to its conclusion. I was starting to read up in 1988, 89. And hence, I identified it as a kind of once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for a researcher to follow the birth of a new state, to follow the birth of a new nation. So I decided on Eritrea as my dissertation fieldwork, and applied then the EPLF office in London, actually, in 89, 90, to do fieldwork in the liberated areas of EPLF, because I wanted to study recruitment to EPLF, not from the Ethiopian side, so to say, not from the Derg regime side. And they accepted my application, going a bit back and forth. But it ended up that they held me back, so to say, as the active warring came towards its conclusion. So I managed to get in, I think, the first batch of foreigners. We were just a handful going in just after the fall of Asmara in the summer of 1991, when I arrived in Eritrea. So, and the identification of the village Mawene was by coincidence. I didn't have any former contacts in the country, but I stumbled upon a lady who were returning from Italy, an Eritrean lady who came back also after the fall of Asmara and wanted to visit her family for the first time for many years. And I met her on the streets of Asmara, and we started to talk because, you know, I was the only foreigner in Asmara, more or less. So she approached me and wondered what I was doing there. And I told her, and then she said, you know, why don't you come with me to Mawene? I'm going tomorrow. I said, okay, let's do it. Yeah. So, and hence I ended up in Mawene, a very small village in Dekidigna Warada at that time. In the outskirts of 𝐒𝐂𝐂𝐍𝐃.
Yeah. Well, my wife is from 𝐒𝐂𝐂𝐍𝐃, so, you know, the small world. Yeah.
We are brothers. We are brothers then.
Yeah.
You know about it.
Yeah. So you study peace and conflict. Unfortunately, the area that you study has been very long on the conflict and very short on the peace side. On a hopeful note, though, today, there is a peace process going on in Ethiopia. But to complicate matters, there seems to be some alliances forming between Amhara and Eritrea on one side, and maybe federal government and Tigray on the other. And to complicate things even more, Eritrea's top security team was in Addis recently. So how is the peace process, the Pretoria peace process going? And what will its impact be on the region's long-term peace and stability, do you think?
I think the Pretoria Peace Agreement, both the agreement itself came as a surprise to some of us, that they managed to actually sign an agreement in November last year. But also it has come as a bit of surprise that they have managed to stick by it. Then, I mean, the two main signatories, the authorities in Tigray and the federal government, they have managed to step by step, incrementally implement the agreement. There have been some delays, yes. There have been some issues not being implemented yet, but the overall agreement appears to be rather stable. And the two parties to the agreement appears to agree on, actually, we need to stick by it and we need to implement it. There are some huge challenges ahead when it comes to issues of alien troops in Tigray, meaning both Amhara regional troops in West Tigray, but also Eritrean forces in northern Tigray and parts of West Tigray. How to handle that is the most immediate sticky issue to secure that the whole of territory of Tigray is under the administration of the interim regional government of Tigray, as is prescribed in the peace agreement. Another sticky issue will be obviously the transitional justice process and the accountability of the war crimes and mass atrocities being perpetrated in Tigray. That goes both to Ethiopian federal forces, Amhara regional forces, and obviously Eritrean defense forces, if at all possible, to hold them to account for the atrocities. It also goes obviously to the Tigrayan defense forces, the Tigrayan army, and the accusation of atrocities they perpetrated in northern Amhara and in Afar. That will be a key challenge in how to facilitate a transitional justice mechanism which satisfies the desires of the Tigrayan victims, mainly, since they mainly are Tigrayan victims in terms of majority, in terms of impact of the atrocities. And that brings us directly to the dilemma of peace and justice dilemma. You know, are you jeopardizing the peace process if you are pursuing justice? We can come back to that if that is a later question. So, but the issue that that agreement are still holding, I think it is very important. It stabilizes the main contradiction in Ethiopia, the main conflict line between Tigray and the federal state of Ethiopia has been pacified. And we also see then that TPLF as a political party, has been deregistered as a terrorist organization. TPLF is brought back in from the cold. TPLF is recognized as the main leader of the interim administration. Getachew Reda is appointed as the president, who is an executive committee member of TPLF. And the majority of the cabinet positions in the interim administration are TPLF held. So we are also then awaiting for how TPLF or Tigrayan representation should be reintroduced at the federal level, meaning in the House of Representatives, in federal institutions, and so on and so forth. And this is very positive, obviously, that that conflict has been pacified so far. But as you also, the second part of your question, it's alluding to that it is something going on in Ethiopia and in the region in terms of reconfiguring alliances, reconfiguring political alliances. Who are the new enemies and who are your new friends, so to say? Yeah. And this is a game the Habesha has been playing out for centuries, as you know, totally changing alliances and allegiances in order to claim the center. And we have seen a shift then. The Amhara regional elites were part and parcel of Abiy Ahmed's war on Tigray, together with 𝐒𝐄𝐂𝐻 Afwerki and the Eritrean military apparatus. And by pacifying the Tigray war, by bringing TPLF back in, you have at the same time partly alienated Amhara regional political leadership and 𝐒𝐂𝐻 Afwerki. Both of them have expressed grievances towards deregistering TPLF as a terrorist organization. 𝐒𝐂𝐻 Afwerki have clearly stated that his objectives of Eritrea's war on Tigray has not been fulfilled by the peace agreement. And there are a lot of grievances expressed from Amhara regional political actors that the peace agreement will involve that Amhara needs to give back what they considered rightful Amhara territories in West Tigray. Yeah. And as you have seen over the last couple of 3 weeks, the unrest in Amhara region in terms of demobilizing, as it was called, now it has been rephrased into reintegrating the Amhara regional forces and Fano forces into the federal structure. It is a lot of insecurity. It is a lot of uncertainty. What's happening next in that kind of reconfiguring of the political alliances within Ethiopian political dispensation. Yeah.
It's interesting that attempt to integrate the different forces has created the civil war in Sudan recently. So this war, as you know, has shattered Ethiopia's economy and infrastructure, especially that of Tigray. The devaluation of the birr being one of the many indicators. So with the economy probably at the top, what are the biggest challenges the nations of the Horn are facing now? And how do you think these challenges will shape their future?
I think there are multiple levels and multiple sectors of challenges impacting Ethiopia and every country in the Horn of Africa. You have pointed to the economic crunch, which all countries are experiencing because of the global economic decline and the inflation rates and the costs of energy and so on, and supply chain disruption. Adding to that, the global economic trends is, of course, Ethiopia's own doing in the cost of the war. Both the tremendous borrowing the federal government have done in order to equip its army and to purchase arms and munitions to fight the war. And certainly now, in terms of reconstruction and rebuilding, Tigray, which had the best health infrastructure in Ethiopia, the best educational infrastructure in Ethiopia, which had clearly reached a good level of development, is put back not only 3 years. Tigray is back to square one in 1991, maybe even more destructions in terms of everything they would need to rebuild of health, education, infrastructure, water supply, sanitation, you name it. Enormous cost, and we have seen some estimates already into the billions of dollars. And also Northern Amhara, parts of Afar would also be needed to be reconstructed. I think a lot of the expenses relating to that will be grants and donations from the international community, as long as the peace agreement is implemented. But the general financial crunch of Ethiopia is hurting the country. It also possibly feeding into increased social unrest and political unrest, as we have seen in other countries. But Ethiopia, although Ethiopia was considered and partly still is considered an anchor state in the Horn, a stable government, a government which has the potential to project stability beyond its borders, right. That power has been severely weakened by the civil war in the country over the last 2.5, 3 years. And the continued unrest in Amhara, continued insurgency in Oromia, continued conflicts in many other parts of Ethiopia is weakening the government's capacity to be a stable anchor state of the region at a time when it is needed the most. Look at Khartoum, Sudan over the last couple of weeks. It is an active civil war ongoing in Khartoum as we speak. We don't know how it will spiral out of control or not. So Sudan is still in a mess. Somalia is in deep trouble as usual, I could say. So, and even in Somaliland, you have a new conflict popping up on the border with Puntland. Right. So there is a host of dire challenges confronting the Horn of Africa, and we, I say, or the Horn of Africa is in desperate need of a stable Ethiopia, a strong Ethiopia, to project stability beyond its borders. And hopefully we might return to that, but as it is today, it seems doubtful. Yeah?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Eritrea, as you know, has been a force of instability in the region, but its leadership is getting old, with what appears to be an empty succession pipeline and very weak or non-existent institutions. So it's setting up Eritrea basically for a very uncertain future. So whatever happens in Eritrea, what kind of challenges and opportunities will it create for the region overall, do you think?
I think it's a crucial point you're raising. Eritrea is a geriatric state. It's bewildering that the regime has not managed or not been willing to recruit any new generations of leaders to the pinnacle of powers. The same guys I interviewed in the early 1990s, just after the fall of Asmara, they are still there in the same positions, more or less, with some reshufflements, and some have been frozen and thrown out, and some have come back. Of course, you had the crackdown and arrest in 2001 of several of the key players, which were instrumental in the liberation war and the post-independence period. But Isaias and his cronies are still there, both in the civil leadership, if you can call it that, and also in the military leadership. And, everyone is getting old, very old, and you can have a period of in a 5-year span, more or less all of them will have deceased of natural causes. What's happened to Eritrea then? What will happen to Eritrea if Isaias departs? As you say, there are more or less no functioning institutions in the country but the military. But we also know that the military might have internal differences between the top-level leaderships. So you cannot rely 100% that the military leadership will be a stable government in a transition period when Isaias
Sudan being a good example.
Sudan being an excellent example of that. You might very likely have a similar scenario that 2 or 3 of the top generals will rally their troops to fight for the state, so to say, and the state capture scenario. I think Eritrea will hit a transition head on, a brutal transition with the departure of Isaias in the near future. Well, in the near future, it might mean 10 years. He can still live for 10, 15 years. It's not that. But one day that will happen. We do see maybe some signs that he is grooming his son Abraham to take over. I think if that will happen, I think Abraham would need to be put in a formal position before Isaias dies, because if he dies, I don't think Abraham will have the clout or the legitimacy or the power to assume it himself. Yeah, he must be propped up by his father in a grooming period. We see some tendencies of that today, but not kind of formalized into a vice presidentship or something like that. It wouldn't surprise me if that suddenly pops up, that a new position is being designed for him, either on the civilian or the military side, so to say. It may be more difficult on the military side since he doesn't have that track record, but certainly on the civilian side. The party, you cannot describe it as an ordinary state-bearing party. There are some structures, there are some level of leadership, but it's not a participating party as it once was. The state is not there. The state is the party, and the party is extremely weak. It's a handful of geriatric individuals. So yeah, it is a good question. What will happen when Isaias departs? I think we might have a state collapse rather quickly thereafter. Yeah. And then it's up to the neighbors, Sudan, Ethiopia, Saudi, Emirates, whoever who has an interest, who has a stake in Eritrea, to take control, to secure their assets, to secure their interest, which would probably not be the interest of the Eritrean people. Mm-hmm. And so the Eritrean people will be marginalized once again, possibly. Absolutely. In the transition. Yeah.
Yeah, which leads to my next question. China, US, Europe, Turkey, India, the Gulf states are all active in the Horn of Africa, whose interests may not be aligned with the interests of the local populations. How will the competition of these external powers impact the future of the Horn?
It's sad to observe, actually, how the Cold War scenarios have come back to haunt Horn of Africa. You know, increasing towards the same level we saw in the 1970s and 80s. The competition between China and US as kind of resource-driven, trade-driven, economic-driven is one thing. I think China has the upper hand there as such, at least with the trade and business enterprises. US is bigger in terms of development and humanitarian assistance, but doesn't necessarily no longer have that political clout to back that with. More worrying is obviously the return of Russia to the Horn of Africa. Russia is scouting for naval bases. We hear about Port Sudan, which is kind of phased out. We hear about Eritrea, that Russia will have a claim in Masaba, possibly also Assab for that matter. And when Russia is on board, in terms of what's happening in Ukraine and Europe these days, you suddenly don't have only an economic competition between superpowers, but you have a direct geopolitical and possibly military confrontation between Russia and US interests in the Horn, as we saw in the 1970s and 80s when they both supported each other sides in the proxy wars in Ethiopia and Eritrea and Somalia. So I think that's a very worrying scenario. Obviously, the losers will be the Ethiopian people, the Eritrean people, the Somali people, the Sudanese people, who will be used as pawns once again through their proxies. And I think in particular, Russia, you see the Wagner group is inching towards Eritrea too. We hear rumors about. We know how they operate and how unaccountable they are to the local population and the local needs and communities. They are an extracting mercenary group. They are thriving on the resources in Sudan these days, for instance, and in other Sahelian countries. So I fear for Eritrea and the local Eritreans' interest, both today, but certainly also going forward in terms of stabilizing their country in a transitional period and to rebuild Eritrea after the passing of 𝐒𝐂𝐴 Afwerki.
You mentioned the Habesha history earlier. It's been, a circular history with continuous demonstrations of lose-lose outcomes, especially when you look at it from a long-term perspective. I don't even think it's a win-lose scenario because there are winners and losers in that scenario. So as one who studies peace and conflict for a living, what do you think needs to be taught and practiced now so today's one-year-olds can, live in peace when they come out of age in, I don't know, another 2 decades or so?
I think, as you say, I think we actually need to look upon it in a generational perspective. I think it will take a generation or two, maybe even 3, to stabilize, to transform Ethiopian and Eritrean societies into a more egalitarian, more peacefully oriented societies. I think it is a puzzlement to me, but to many, the fact that political actors so quickly turn to violence to pursue their political goals. It is kind of, in their toolbox of political instruments, violence is more or less on the top, which is unthinkable in the areas where I grew up in Scandinavia, where violence is never ever considered as a political tool to push through your political objectives. In Eritrea, in Ethiopia, it is the first, more or less, instrument you turn to. And that is something which is deeply embedded historically, contemporarily. And then we talk about something, how is this anchored within what I call the political culture of these countries? Why do leaders turn out to be inclined to use suppression and violence to pursue their political objectives? And it's no easy answer to that question. I think in Eritrea, to be very frank, for the last 25 years, the majority of the Eritrean population within the country has more or less been socialized into a warring tradition.
Yeah.
And we saw that from very early on when Isaias took power in 91, 93. You see the charter, the national charter, which was introduced in 1994. You see the rationale behind the national service. You see the rationale behind various policies in the early 1990s, indicated an interest to perpetuate the warring tradition of EPLF and to impose that on the Eritrean population at large, which has been very damaging, which has been destructive towards reconciliatory civilian spirits of the Eritrean cultures. And I think that partly explains, to be very frank, how Eritrean defense forces, how the ordinary rank and file soldiers perpetrated mass atrocities, rape and violence towards civilian Tigrayans, towards their brothers and sisters across the border. How could they do that without themselves being broken down and stunted in terms of understanding civility, understanding equality, understanding humanity? I think Isaias have managed to destroy humanity in Eritrea. And I think it needs generation to rebuild that. And that's an extremely sad observation. I know, I was living there for years in the villages. I know the potential the cultures do have in terms of reconciliation, in terms of civility, in terms of hospitality, in terms of expressing compassion and love. I don't see that today. And that, when we see the gruesome events having taken place over the last 2 or 3 years.
Yep.
And I don't blame that on the ordinary people. I blame it on the regime and on Isaias Afwerki.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I think, like you mentioned, the general population still has that culture of generosity and caring for each other. It's just that the ruling elites have pretty much destroyed that. So to drill down on that sad note, Eritrea has been lighting fires across nations in the region. And in the process, it has severely weakened itself from the inside, as you have outlined. Many of its young and relatively better educated have perished in these reckless adventures. So the depletion of these millions of man-years of productivity will make nation building extremely difficult, if not impossible. Still, it's a small country with sufficient resources which to the perennially optimistic leaves, some hope to hold on to. So is Eritrea a case of as bad as things are, they can still get worse, or is it things are so bad they can't get worse scenario? So what does this political anthropologist say about where this is heading?
Well, it's one thing is to analyze current affairs. To predict the future is always a tall order. So and it goes beyond academia, so to say. But there are both some negatives and some positives if you can try to look into the future of Eritrea. The negatives are, as we have talked about, the destruction of various cultures and traditions and local communities in Eritrea. Not only the values and the cultural traits, but I was just up in Trondheim in the middle of Norway this weekend, and by coincidence, my taxi driver from the airport to the hotel, he was an Eritrean young man, and of course I chatted with him. And he talked about he came to Norway some 10 years ago as a young man escaping national service. And we talked about his family and his life in Eritrea and so on. And he represents the traditional Eritrean family today, where back in Eritrea might be a mother and a father, maybe one younger sister or two, but the rest of the siblings are scattered all over the world. Yeah. All over the world. Families are dispersed, families are fragmented, lineages are fragmented. That kind of social cohesion has been totally undermined by 𝐒𝐄𝐂𝐻 Afwerki, by the regime, when most of the Eritrean population today are living in diaspora. The majority of Eritreans are in diaspora, not inside the country. And that is a tragedy when it comes to the situation today. It might actually be a blessing or a help when it comes to rebuilding Eritrea, if the resources and capacities of the diaspora are properly funneled and harnessed to contribute back home to rebuilding. But then, as we saw in the 1990s, with the generations of refugees in the 70s and 80s returned home or contributed to the diaspora. But then it must be some promises that the next regime, the transition, must be something else than what we have seen over the last 30 years. It cannot be EPLF reinvented. It must be something else. And that's where the downside is. Can the Eritreans come together to agree upon a new common future? We know there are a lot of differences of opinions, both, within the political landscape of the opposition, which are generally, in my view, very weak. We know there are very differences of opinion between political representatives from the highland Tigrinya community versus lowland minority communities on what Eritrea is supposed to be in the future. Will you manage to come together to find a common dispensation, to find a common vision for Eritrea? As I see today, I don't see it in opposition. And that's, again, is the tragedy, that you don't even manage to come together to unite against Isaias, against this authoritarian suppressive regime in the diaspora. You are either muted or fragmented or opposing each other, which of course is an effect of the regime itself, and the regime are continuously splitting and destabilizing any kind of processes who tries to pull Eritreans together in diaspora, because that's a threat. That's the only threat they see. It will come from the diaspora, not from within, as they believe they have a total control of their own society. I don't necessarily believe that any longer. I think the last war might have put in motion some processes which might come back and bite Isaias in the ass, so to say. But it's still too early to see the consequences of that. Yeah. So it is. I don't know what will happen with Eritrea. I don't know how you can build on the positives and try to mitigate the negatives. It might go both ways. We might have a new success story, or it might be a continued perpetual chaos of a new kind of Somalization in Eritrea for decades to come.
Yeah, I know I have to let you go, but one question. You mentioned homogeneous societies and how peaceful they are and all that, which is true. But not all homogeneous societies are democratic. Somalia, China, North Korea, for example. But they do have a better chance of being democratic. So is there something inherently wrong with multi-ethnic, multi-religious societies that tends to make them anti-democratic? Sure, there are elections held in diverse communities, but they seem to resort to identity-based politics, which seems to be part of the root problem. So how can this toxicity in identity politics be toned down so tolerant and peaceful coexistence can become sort of a norm? So is there something wrong with the diverse societies that tends to make them undemocratic?
No, I don't think you can say that. And I think research indicates the same, that it is not necessarily the heterogeneous qualities of a society which make them undemocratic, and it's not necessarily the homogeneous qualities of societies which makes them democratic. It's much more complicated than that. Look at Eritrea in 1991, after the fall of Asmara. More or less 100% of the Eritreans inside and outside the country were totally supportive and behind the government at that time. You had some very few dissenting voices. You had some few segments which might have questioned, we should do that and that. There might have been, if the referendum in 1993 had been totally free and fair in a sense, there might have been maybe 2, 3, 4% who would have voted for a federal model with Ethiopia because it is better for economic development and so on. But basically, you had 100% support from your own people. You had 100% support from the international community to build a democratic, stable, peaceful Eritrea. The regime screwed it up in a matter of 3-4 years. So, and Eritrea was as heterogeneous at that time as it is today. So but of course, the way politics have been run over the last 2 or 3 decades have managed to totally eradicate that social cohesion you had in the early 1990s, and again pitted people against each other. That has been a deliberate strategy of Isaias, to pit people against each other, to divide the Eritrean people based on religion, based on ethnicity, and so on and so forth. Although he claims the opposite,
of course,
but he has actually managed to divide you because of the suppression, because of the authoritarian practices, and so on and so forth. And I think Eritrea is a very small population group, population basis. You have a small territory, you have a lot of resources, you have a lot of competent people in diaspora, educated, experienced, and so on. So I do think you have a great potential, again, if you manage to come together with the common vision on what will happen after Isaias's departure. That is the challenge. Obviously, I know several Eritrean initiatives working on that now and over the last few years, but none of them have kind of materialized into a more all-inclusive or more generally accepted process. Hopefully that will happen.
Yeah, so on that positive note, we'll end today's conversation, basically to bring back the spirit of 1991 and galvanize people along those thoughts. So, Professor Kjetil Tronvoll, I appreciate your spending this time with us. Thank you very much for your insights.
My pleasure to all, anytime. Thank you.
عدد ساتلايت تلفزيون إيريسات نبهاجر كندان حبرات منقسات أمريكان كما أتسألتنايتي أب أمريكا زجبرنا عدد إيريسات أب حنت ختمة حبرات منقسات أمريكان أب سلسة ختمات كندان مالت وينيبيغ ميازيا أسران كلتن مينيابوليس مينيسوتا أسران سلستن ميازيا إدمنتن ميازيا أسران شعتن كم الدما أب تورونتو ميازيا سلاسة تشحن أسران سلستن عدد كنجبرينا كلكم دليت فتحي أبزن كتماتاتن كبابي انزل لكم أبتن نقبرو نائهن مهن مدرخ مسانا حبيركم كتوعلو بخبرنا الدم بدحان مصو ساتلايت تلفزيون إيريسات
بمعرنة كله نقول ساتفا سنة فتح السلام حدنة حقيفة عم فتكة مأزن رأيك تسسن دمتكم سمعوا مقالح كنوا إيريسات